Masechet Nazir, Daf Lamed, the final Mishnah of the fourth Perek, teaches Ha'ish megalech al nezirut aviv ve'en ha'isha megalachat al nezirut aviha. There is a case in which a son can use the father's money to shave. In other words, if a father became a Nazir and set aside money, and then died and was not able to use that money, the son can use that money to pay for his own concluding Nazir sacrifices. We'll define exactly which case that is. However, a woman cannot use the money of her father. If her father in the same situation was a Nazir, set aside money, died without completing, a woman is not allowed in any circumstance to use that money for her own Nizirut. The Gemara is going to explain that this relates to inheritance law. Since a son inherits the father, so he can in some way inherit this money, even though the money is really consecrated money. Nevertheless, he can inherit it in the consecrated state and use it for the same purpose. However, a daughter who generally does not inherit unless there's no sons, so she's out of the picture. Gemara will explain further the difference between a son and a daughter here. Now, kesad, in what case can a son use the father's money? We already saw a long baraita that said that a son can basically never use a father's hatat offering. If the father sinned and set aside money or an animal for hatat, the son cannot use that. But Nazir is different. And there is one case in which the son can use it. It has to be ma'ot situmim, unallocated funds. And now there's a question about, is it necessary that the father and son were Nazirim at the same time? Or that the father was a Nazir and the son was not. The son only became a Nazir after the father died. So we're going to see a machloket about this. The following Mishnah is going to come to us in two versions. We have one version here in the Mishnah that's printed in the Talmud Bavli. This is equivalent to the Mishnah in the manuscript, the Kaufman manuscript, which I have right here, which is considered the oldest and most accurate manuscript. This is the version of the Mishnah in other Mishnah manuscripts in the Talmud Yerushalmi also, and matches up with what we find in the Tosefta. So this has old and qualified tradition. What makes it complicated is that the Talmud Bavli, soon you will see, is going to quote a different version that switches around the opinions. Different version of this Mishnah. Now, in order to reconcile them, the Rosh changed this Mishnah and switched around the cases. And if you look at the art scroll, that's what they do. They follow the Rosh and they erase this case, put it here, erase this case, and put it here. That way it reconciles. But there is zero manuscript evidence for doing that, especially considering the Tosefta and Yerushalmi and all the manuscripts of the Mishnah itself. Okay, therefore, what we have to say instead is that there are, in fact, two different versions of this machloket and of this Mishnah. One that comes from Eretz Yisrael, which would be the Mishnah-only manuscripts, the Tosefta, the Yerushalmi, as opposed to the Bavli that has a different version of this machloket. Okay, so let's see it inside. Kesad. Mi shaya aviv nazir v'ifrish ma'ot setumim al neziruto v'amet. Ve'amar hareni nazir al menat shagaleach al me'ot abba. Okay, the case is if a father was a nazir himself, that's it, and he set aside money unallocated, meaning he didn't say that this $100 will be for chatat, this 100 for olah. He just said all 300 will be for my sacrifices, and he dies before concluding. And then the son says, I'll be a Nazir as long as on condition that when I conclude and shave, I can use my father's money. That's where it works. Why would that work? Because the father had this money. He couldn't use it. The son can inherit it and use it himself. However, if it was a case where the father and son both were Nazirim at the same time and the father dies, in that case it wouldn't work. He can't use the father's money because since the son himself was a Nazir at the same time, so he's obligated to bring his own funds. He already has an obligation to bring sacrifices from his own funds, so he can't use his father's money. Only if the son was not a Nazir and becomes a Nazir later, and he says, I'm going to use my father's money, which has no use right now, then it works. Okay, it seems that that would be the opinion of the sages, of the Chachamim. And Rabbi Yosef disagrees with that. This is the simple reading of the Mishnah. Now, usually when someone disagrees, it says the name first, Rabbi Yosef Omer, although here, that doesn't say that. Okay, but nevertheless, based on Tosefta and the way the Yerushalmi reads it, I think it's clear that Rabbi Yosef is arguing on what's above. I'll try to read the Mishnah in a different way in a second. All right, but this is the simple reading of the Mishnah. Amar Rabbi Yosef, Hare elu yipeludin dava en ze megalech al nezirut aviv. Rabbi Yosef disagrees with the sages and says, no, this money that the father allocated and then died, you have to just, since it was unallocated, but he designated the money, but it's unallocated for each individual sacrifice, you use it all for communal voluntary offerings. And the son cannot use that for his concluding sacrifices in that case. Rather, Rabbi Yosef says, I think that it's the opposite, the other way around, it works. When can a son do it? He agrees that someone can. In other words, everybody agrees with the first opening line. If there is a case in which a son can use the father's money. Oh, so what is that case? In other words, the other way around, where if the father and the son were both Nazirim at the same time while the father was alive, and the father designated money but didn't allocate it for each sacrifice, and then the father died and wasn't able to conclude, that's where the son can use it. And that actually makes more sense. In a different line of reasoning, you could say, since they were Nazirim at the same time, so they're more connected. And so that money that the father designated, although he designated it for himself, but it was at the same time that the son was also a Nazir, so then it's much easier to argue that the Nazir can say, listen, that money was designated while I was a Nazir also. Where there were parallel Nazirim. If he's not going to use it, I'll use it. Whereas the other case, if the father was a Nazir and the son was not, and the father died, well then that's it. That Nazirut and that money is gone. If the son then makes a new Nazirut, well, that has nothing to do with the father's Nazirut. They don't overlap in time. So the son cannot bring those funds, right? So there's a good logic for either way. And so you see, the Rabbi Yosef is the one that says that they have to be Nazirim simultaneously. Whereas the Chachamim, we're going to name the Chachamim in the other version of this, the rest of the sages say, no, it only works when they're not simultaneous, when only the father and then the son. All right, that's the simple reading of the Mishnah again, and that's the reading in the Yerushalmi and the Tosefta, and in the Mishnah manuscripts, the Mishnah only manuscripts, and in the Bavli manuscripts of the Mishnah too. Okay, but what happened? What happened over time is that Talmud Bavli was transmitted Bavli only without the Mishnah sometimes, and so the Mishnah that's included on the Bavli page is not always the same Mishnah that the Babylonian Amoraim had. And so this can be one of those examples where the Bavli Amoraim had one version of the Mishnah, and the Mishnah that we find on the Bavli page is actually the Eretz Yisrael version of the Mishnah. As we'll see, the Bavli is going to quote it. Now we're ready to analyze the Gemara. The Mai Ta'ama. What is the difference? Why should there be a difference between a daughter and a son inheriting or using the funds of the father? Amar Rabbi Yochanan halachahi ben Nazir. Rabbi Yochanan, this is already the third time we say Rabbi Yochanan saying this phrase. He actually says a few more times, and that are going to come up later on. So Rabbi Yochanan has this phrase, there are a few oral laws that we have to do with Nazir, and can't find a source for it in the Torah, And that's just the way it is. It is a oral law that's from Sinai and has the status of a deoraita. And this is another one of the applications of this oral law, which is that although generally, as we saw in Khatat, if a father designates something to be a Korban Khatat, that's it, no one else can use it. But the oral law says, no, here's a leniency, which is that a son can, in fact, use the money that was allocated by the father. If the father died before completing his Nazirut, the son can use that money designated as long as it was not specifically allocated for these various sacrifices. So that's the reason why a man can. Now, a woman cannot. So we ask about that. Peshita, isn't it obvious that a daughter isn't going to be able to? After all, a daughter doesn't inherit. So if it doesn't even inherit regular money, certainly she's not going to inherit this kind of consecrated money. So isn't that obvious? Why does the Mishnah have to teach it to us? Is the Mishnah coming to teach us that a son inherits and a daughter doesn't? We know that. That's explicit in the Torah. So the answer is La sedicha delet le elabat v'hodetema yorshin gemirin la kamashmalan halacha. Oh, I might have thought that if a man doesn't have any sons and he only has a daughter or daughters, then since the daughters inherit his money, his free property, chulin property, then I might have thought that the daughter can then use the father's designated money for a Nazir, and she can become a Nazirah and use that money to pay for her sacrifices. Why would I think that? I might have thought that this whole thing works through an inheritance, and therefore it would follow all the other laws of inheritance. This question is going to come up again at the end of the sugya, in which we wonder, what if there's two sons? What if there's a bechor? Right? Does this follow the regular pattern of inheritance or not? Anyway, as long when it comes to daughters, kamash malan halacha, the answer is no. It does not follow the regular pattern of inheritance. For regular inheritance, if there's no sons, the daughters do inherit. However, for this particular law, this is an oral tradition that is exceptional. And a son can use the designated Nazir money of the father, but a daughter never can, even if there are no sons. All right, good. Now, question about the Mishnah. In the Mishnah, at least according to the reading of the Bavli, in whatever version it had, has only the opinion of Rabbi Yosef, and not the opinion of Rabbanan. You could actually read the Mishnah that way if you take, remember it says Amar Rabbi Yosef, not as a machloket, but as a continuation. And if so, you can read it, right, Kesad, what is this law all about? Well, if there was one after the other, Rabbi Yosef said it's no good. And so where can it work? Only if they were Nazirim at the same time, right? If they were one after the other, it's no good. They have to be at the same time. So you could read this as being all the opinion of Rabbi Yosef and not reporting the opinion of Chachamim at all. And that doesn't change the opinion of Rabbi Yosef, right? No matter whether you read Ahmad as arguing or not, or continuing, either way, Rabbi Yosef would say, if they're Nazirim one after the other, the father dies Nazir, and only then the son became a Nazir, you cannot use the money. Whereas the simultaneous, you can use the money. So Rabbi Yosef remains the same, just doesn't report about Chachamim. So we're wondering, what about Chachamim? Do they agree? Do they disagree? And if they disagree, do they disagree with the entire thing? Do they agree with the first half or the second half? Right? Do they say you can always use the money, never use the money, the other way around? All right, let's see. Tashema, and here's the answer. And so now we're quoting the Bavli's version. Either you could say their version of the Mishnah, or a Braita that they have that is parallel to whatever version of the Mishnah that they have. And you can see here in this one that the opinions are actually the opposite, as in our Mishnah. Kesad amru ha'ish megalech al nezirut aviv. In what case can a son use the father's funds for his concluding sacrifices? Mi shaya aviv nazir v'frish aviv ma'ot linziruto umet V'amar hareni nazir al menat shagaleach al me'ot abba, zehu shemegaleach al me'ot aviv. Aval mi shayahu ve'aviv nazirim ve'ifrish aviv ma'ot l'naziruto v'amet, hare elu yipelu l'indavad divrei Rabbi Yosef. So this entire paragraph is Rabbi Yosef. We're going to see the other opinion afterwards. So what does Rabbi Yosef say? If a father himself was a Nazir only, he designated money and died before he concluded, and then the son picked up, so this is a one after the other case, and said, I'll be a Nazir on condition that I could use my father's money, that works. See, in this version, Rabbi Yosef says one after the other works, but if the father and the son were both Nazirim simultaneously, and the father designated money and died, then you have to use the money only for communal sacrifices, and the son cannot use it, and that's the opinion of Rabbi Yosef. Okay, so right here, you see, this is the opposite of the Mishnah. The Bavli never asks, wait, this Baraita is the opposite of the Mishnah. How do we reconcile it? In fact, that it does not ask means that the Bavli is actually quoting either their version of the Mishnah or a Baraita that is the same as their version of the Mishnah. All right. Now, to answer the question, this is the opinion of Rabbi Yosef. Do Chachamim disagree? Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yoshuv, Rabbi Yehuda, Amru zehu shemegaleach al me'ot aviv. They say no. The second case that Rabbi Yosef brought, that is a case where it does work. Zehu shemegaleach. So in other words, they flip it around the opposite way, and they say if the father and the son were Nazirim at the same time, then the son can use that of the father, but if there was one after the other, then they cannot. All right, so we see that the rest of the sages, in fact, disagree on the Resha and disagree with the Sefa. They have the opposite logic. Okay, the two versions of the Mishnah, the one from Eretz Yisrael and the one from Bavel, when read according to their Peshat, at least they both agree that there is a disagreement, right? In other words, Rabbi Yosef says one way, and the other sages say the other way around. Just the difference between the two versions is who says what. In the Eretz Yisrael version of the Mishnah, it's the sages that say it has to be one after the other, but simultaneous doesn't work. In the Bavli version, it's Rabbi Yosef that says it has to be one after the other, but simultaneous does not work. Okay, so this is a really fascinating and very important example of the way the Mishnah was recorded and interpreted. Now, we're going to end with a few questions. Ba'e Rabbah. יש לו שני בנים נזירים מהו הלכתה גמירין לה וכל דקדם גלח או דילמה ירושה גמירין לה ופלגה הווה. If a person has two sons and he went through this whole thing, he was a Nazir, he died, and he left money, and the two sons that both want to be Nazirim. So how does it work? If it's a halacha, it's an oral tradition. If it's an oral tradition, then it doesn't use the mechanism of regular inheritance. So according to that, whoever is a Nazir, concludes his Nazirut first, can take all the money, right? Because they don't have to split it evenly. There is this money available that the father had, and any son that uses it first can use all of it. Or do we say, no, it works as a Yerusha? Even though it's not regular chulin money, they can't go and buy something in the store. Nevertheless, this is consecrated money for a Nazir that gets split evenly, and therefore son A gets half, son B gets half, and son A, when he finishes Nazirut, he could use his half. Son B, it's waiting there, and whenever he wants to finish his Nazirut, he can use the other half. That's question number one. We don't answer it. Now, what if, more complicated, one is his firstborn son, and the second is a regular son. Now, for a regular inheritance, this firstborn is going to get double. So that means the firstborn will get 2/3, and the secondborn will get 1/3. So maybe it's simply an oral tradition, and therefore you don't have to only use according to the amount of the inheritance that they would get. You would say first come, first serve. Whoever's first can take even the second son, if he shaves first, can take the entire amount. Or do you say it's going to follow within inheritance? Now, even if you say it uses the inheritance, there's still going to be a further question. So right now we're saying maybe it's inheritance totally, and just like an inheritance, it'll be double, 2/3 and 1/3. So too here, the firstborn son gets 2/3, and even if the second son finishes his Nazirut first, he can only use 1/3, and the 2/3 is left for the firstborn. But within that, there's still a further question. Even if you say it follows the general laws of inheritance, and based on how much inheritance the brother would get, that's what he can use for his Nazirut. But you still might say, only regarding chulin, non-consecrated inheritance, that's when the firstborn gets double. But if it's consecrated, then the firstborn does not get double. In other words, maybe they split it half-half, because you apply the general inheritance and to the consecrated money, but the bechor status you do not apply to consecrated money. Or since he's using it, and he can use it for the purpose of his shaving, whenever we say shaving, we mean for his concluding ceremony and the sacrifices that he has to pay for, so it doesn't matter, and yes, he gets double. So in other words, we have actually 3 possibilities in this scenario when there's a bechor and one other son. It could be whoever shaves first gets all of it. It could be that they split it half-half and we ignore the bechor law, or it could be that the bechor gets 2/3 and the second one gets 1/3. All right, another question. Aviv Nazir Olam v'hu Nazir Stam. Aviv Nazir Stam v'hu Nazir Olam Mai. Ki gemirin hilchata b'stam Nazirut o dilma lo shena. Let's say they are different types of Nazirim. A father says, I'm going to be a Nazir Olam. If you remember, a Nazir Olam is someone who remains a Nazir forever, but every so often, when their hair becomes too unkempt, about every year or so, they can cut their hair, trim it, and then they would bring a set of 3 korbanot. So a Nazir Olam also brings korbanot. So a father says, I'm a Nazir Olam. He set aside money so that he could do his trimming, and then he died. Now the son decides to be a regular Nazir for 30 days, a limited time Nazir. Can the son use the father's money, or do you say these are different types of Nazirut, or the other way around? If the father was a regular Nazir, set aside money and died, and then the son wants to be a Nazir Olam, or again, if they're simultaneous, depending on the machloket before. The point is that they are different types of Nazirim. So can you use it, even though it's a different type? On the one hand, maybe this oral tradition is only referring to the same type of Nazirut, Stam Nazirut and Stam Nazirut. The father was for 30 days and the son was for 30 days. Then he can use it. But if it's different types, then he can't. Or maybe the oral tradition teaches that it doesn't matter, and he can do it no matter what. All right, that's another question. And without answering that one, we build another. And let's say we're both talking about the concluding sacrifices after they were pure the whole time. And so that's where the son can use that of the father. Here's built another question. Aviv Nazir Tameh v'hu Nazir Tahor. Aviv Nazir Tahor v'hu Nazir Tameh. What if the father was a Nazir who became Tameh Met, and he designated money for his 2 birds and his animal, and then died before bringing those sacrifices, and they were unallocated. And then the son is a Nazir Tahor. He never became Tameh, and he wants to use the same money. Instead of buying 2 birds, he wants and an animal, he wants to use this money to buy the 3 animals for concluding Nazirut. Or the other way around, if the father designated the money for his concluding korbanot, and the son became tameh in the middle and wants to use the money instead for buying his sacrifices for becoming tameh. Can you do that? Can you switch off in that way? Take all. We leave these questions standing, and with that we complete the 4th perek. Hadran alach mi she'amar.